Hey Ken, how's it going? How you feeling today?
Hey Matt, I'm doing well, all things considered with the weather outside, but just continuing to uh, keep moving the needle. Um, Tomorrow's my birthday, so
Oh, nice.
all things considered, feeling grateful.
Yeah. How do you want to move the needle?
Um, I think for me, it's continuing to find alignment around uh, the why and the spaces and places and people I find myself around. Um, Continuing to have faith that in due time it will all work out, and that the objective that I need to focus on is, quite honestly, living long enough to see those moments and opportunities and circumstances come together.
Hmm. What would that look like if we're all lucky enough to have you around long enough? What would those dreams look like?
I think I've never been good at the where do you see yourself in 5 years. Literally, I recall the first person who ever asked me that in a previous office environment. And interestingly enough, their trajectory has changed completely. And they were a senior leader at the time.
Hmm.
For me, I do believe that institutions matter. I think creating blueprints for larger kind of I just think that institutions are often overlooked, um, and I would love to kind of be involved in building or stewarding um, an institution. I caveat that by saying, we have a lot of great institutions that just need fresh coat of paint,
Hmm.
um, and I think that there's a tremendous power and significance to historical legacy, to context. I firmly believe that. And so the ability to play a role in helping build from a place of context um, matters, and is something that I hope I can be a part of, um, if not form myself, if I don't necessarily see those areas being addressed.
Hmm. And you're involved in a lot of work in the community, West Harlem Development Corporation, institutions like Columbia as a community scholar. Um, and one of the things I miss is, pre-COVID, you and I bumped into each other a lot in the street in Morningside Heights, West Harlem, Subway, like a lot of places. It was fun. And you've always had good, books to recommend and fresh ideas, fresh coats of paint. Um, so this is our virtual space, but I'm wondering in the community, West Harlem, Morningside Heights, what are you noticing lately?
Um, I think that it's hard to not see the ways in which COVID has affected um, my neighbors. I mean, I guess what I notice most immediately is one of my neighbors who's no longer with us, who would always sit on the stoop, right?
Mm,
And, um, you know, while I, I'd read an article about kind of those relationships that might not be primary relationships, but kind of secondary, tertiary relationships of folks you always noted as kind of a marker of your peripheral, who's around you, who's moving
mm,
in the same spaces, and the ways that shifted. because of COVID. Um, I think you note the food bank lines. You note kind of the ways in which the usual traffic patterns of walking in the streets have been disruptive and disrupted rather.
Mhm.
You note uh, certainly from community board meetings um, the increase in um, drug trafficking in certain areas and just kind of opportunities that are um, emerging because people's habits have been different. I've noticed having a chance to kind of flyer um, promoting the summer program,
Mhm.
the ways in which you know the ways in which different areas, um, the fragmentation sometimes, right?
Mhm.
Like how um, how different floors in a building can be their
Mhm.
own universe.
Wow.
And I think building bridges to allow for our community to feel connected to what's happening, to opportunity, to um, information is important. And then you recognize like digital helps. It's
Mhm.
not the only um, because people are fatigued.
Yeah.
People are not engaging with email as much as they used to. Um, Folks are, you know, exhausted for a multitude of reasons of trying to make it through the day and navigate what tomorrow will look like. Um, and at the same time, I'd also be neglectful to not mention folks for whom their world really hasn't changed. If anything, it's afforded them a pause, a lapse that, you know, others have not been able to, others who are perhaps caught just trying to figure out what the new normal is and adjust to
Mhm.
that and um,
Mhm.
kind of find agency in their own lives in the midst of this pandemic, something that they have not necessarily been afforded in the same way.
Mhm.
So those are, I think, some of the observations I've made, and then conversations with friends that born and raised who acknowledge that young people need opportunity, need um, role models, need play um, in order to kind of be a fuller version of who we know they have the possibility and who they know they have the possibility to become. Um, and then all that's kind of mixed in with this larger systemic shift in the workforce, in just the future of work, in um, what tomorrow looks like.
Mhm. A lot of unknown things out there, but still opportunity and possibility and connecting, especially young people, um, to opportunities in the future, which makes me wonder about, there's going to be a whole new set of elected leaders in the city council, mayor, and on and on. So I guess I wonder how there might be ways of um, sharing those concerns that you just spelled out with those leaders and future leaders. All right.
I th-
I don't. I have. Is it storytelling? Is it inviting people to community events, digital you mentioned.
I mean, I think that the approach is there's no one way. I think that what's interesting is just there's a lot of information that needs to be shared, particularly when it comes to the elections in a very short period of time, right? You've got folks that are going to have to unpack ranked choice voting, and you're going to have to make a message digestible.
Yeah.
I had a friend last week hit me up out the blue, and born and raised New Yorker, who wanted to talk about Manhattan Borough president race because they knew I was involved uptown, and they've been a fan of Gail Brewer, and then suddenly term limited, so you've got to identify who stands for what. And I think one of the realities of this situation, this election cycle has kind of crept up on a lot of folks. When you're in the midst of navigating your own uncertainty, it makes it kind of challenging to look up and look around and really kind of sometimes get to the heart of what your concerns are and addressable avenues for those concerns, at a time when, quite honestly, everyone's promising you the world. And I believe that it kind of is incumbent on us to use the institutional memories of our communities and elders and folks that have been around the way to kind of unpack what some of those priorities can look like, and perhaps where some of the candidates stand on some of those issues. Just making it, making the information connect through the perspectives of folks who are on the ground, who hear things, who see things, who call elected officials, who are civic minded, and also being open to fresh perspectives from folks who want to see change and may not know which vehicles or avenues are the appropriate ones for that change to manifest, but not kind of reducing their value and perspective in the process.
Yeah. So you mentioned, people's perspectives without reducing them. I'm wondering what kind of messages would you want to send to upcoming leaders without reducing it, like without making it a bumper sticker or a talking point? Is there an important message that you would want to convey to leaders?
I think one of the messages is simply continuing to prioritize those who may historically have been at the margins. The good thing about representative democracy, when it functions well, is, it's something that we talk a lot about as a marker for effectiveness. The bad thing is sometimes it doesn't function all that well. And so I think thinking about how community changes and shifts is important, because sometimes the folks who really want to show up aren't able to. And so we need to kind of speak to the voices that may not always be in the room. And our elected officials should learn to do the same. And I think that's an urgent need because their voice matters just as much, and their perspective deserves to be heard and considered.
Yeah, and I'm going to ask another question about the election because by when comes out, the election will be right upon us. So you mentioned things that you would want in a candidate. They would listen. They would prioritize those at the margins. Any other attributes of qualities of, let's say, a mayor that you would hope to see?
Um, I think it's important to recognize the moment in time. And so, what are some of those transformations that we're in the midst of? And kind of how are we thinking about what those moments represent in order to look differently and see differently? Um, because those moments don't always come along. And I think that there's a real urgency of now, um, across a lot of different sectors that we should be paying attention to. Um, I'm also a steering committee member for the Inclusive Growth Initiative for New York City, focused on, making it accessible for working class families, and the city that they want to see.
Mm.
And I think that there's a lot to be said for the ways that some of our current structures don't actually afford access to those very communities, in a way that maybe they were designed to initially, but then fell out of kind of step with that for a
Mm-hmm.
variety of reasons.
Mm-hmm.
And so we can't just presume access.
Mm-hmm.
We must continue to critique and continue to kind of assess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you're involved in that committee and the community board, like you mentioned. Are there any stories of people you've worked with or interacted with that you'd want to elevate, who or might be emblematic of a problem or of an access issue?
I mean, for me, during my time on the Youth and Education and Libraries Committee for Community Board 9 in West Harlem, one of the most stalwart examples, I guess, has really been this the idea of, it was connected to the proposed TCCS expansion, and kind of when they were outgrowing their space, and ways to prioritize where those eighth graders were headed and the concerns of their parents, while also acknowledging that there was a proposal on the table for a co-location at a local district school that hadn't been co-located before. And so, there was a series of conversations that were had. I can't have the community board take all the credit. There were avenues for facilitating those conversations, but the net result was realizing that the timeline just wasn't ideal and adequate for anyone. And in the process, realizing that those district schools had needs. The district school had a need that was being overlooked, quite honestly, or not heard.
Mm-hmm.
And you ended up having parents carefully consider their options, and effectively, one group of parents come together to advocate on behalf of another.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, it's always been a reminder in my own head.
Mm-hmm.
A litmus test is when you can get a parent to care about someone else's kids just as much as they might care about their own. I think that's a powerful reminder of the ways in which we can all kind of utilize our voice,
Mm-hmm.
to uplift and to get results.
Yeah.
And that's not a quick process. It takes patience. It takes coordination. I actually believe that as much as we desire efficiency, inefficiency is kind of a cornerstone of inclusive transformation. And I saw that play out in that particular situation, which tells me it's possible.
Nice. Yeah. And, you mentioned the needs of this group of parents and families. And this is a question I always am curious about whenever I interview people is how do we determine needs of people? Like how do we know what the needs are? And maybe also an extended version of that question is how do we know what the assets are?
Yeah. I mean, I think part of that is tied to listening, to not always speaking on behalf of, but creating the platforms and reducing the barriers to entry for those who can speak on behalf of themselves, um, making space. And also, I would say having a direction to kind of the end result, or not an exercise in exercise's sake, but an actual on ramp into a process, into a resource that helps ensure that we are creating and kind of re-strengthening, restitching the social net that we're putting out there, because we know the multitude of ways in which that social net has been decimated over the years. And so when we go through the work of structuring and designing inclusive processes and practices, let those not be in vain, because there's a shift. There's a generation out there that's seen broken promises, and I think that our ability to continue forward will be contingent on our ability to engage with additional voices. And if you continue to not perhaps pay attention or be aware of what those voices have to say, and if it becomes an exercise in futility, then folks will walk away from the process.
Yeah.
We all suffer when that happens. And I think that we need to understand why that needs to be a consideration, and a grounding principle almost of how we design going forward.
And it seems like the we in that situation might be institutions you mentioned earlier could do a better job at listening, making space, getting buy-in for local needs, right? And knowing local assets and strengths.
I mean, the Schomburg just, appointed a new director, right? Executive director. And it's a woman who has kind of committed her pledge to thinking more about the diaspora in the context of the Schomburg's archives. And, there are ways to creatively bridge so that you can kind of remain core to your principles and to your mission, while also expanding beyond to welcome in kind of a more timely revisiting, retelling of where we're at.
Nice. I'll have to link to her work. That sounds pretty timely and powerful strategy to have that core, and then notice what's going on in addition to that on a regular basis. Um, I'm curious too, you mentioned earlier uh, about just, what you're noticing and feeling. Um, we're still in the pandemic and there's all kinds of burnout. You mentioned digital burnout for sure. We won't keep this Zoom much longer to not get burned out. So I'm wondering how you sustain yourself as an advocate, activist, somebody who's super engaged. It's hard work, but how do you keep it going?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question, and I'll also acknowledge the current director's name at the Schomburg is Joy Bivens for those who may be interested in learning more. It's hard. I've had a lot of probably my hardest conversations with peers during this pandemic who haven't been able to turn off, haven't been able to look away. Um, and I've seen a range of kind of healthy approaches, unhealthy approaches. But the reality is, there in many instances there isn't a Calvary, right? We know that. We collectively are it, and so
Mm,
I think sometimes operating from that understanding is interesting. I've seen some deeply rooted community organizations for whom they've never anticipated outside resources.
mm,
Um, I've seen friends that have had to leave the city because, you know, they're operating on in out of the South Bronx and folks have, you know, OD'd on their step, right? So, it means something profoundly different when it comes to like how the pandemic kind of hits close to home.
yeah.
Um, and, you know, I had I've pretty much been in the city since the pandemic started. Um, I think the first time I left was September, um, late September, and at the behest of a friend who said like, come upstate and get away for a couple of days. Um, but I think that I picked up a bike, um, so kind of cycling, being outdoors. I think that making sure to walk to the water, to the
Mm,
Hudson Piers Park,
yeah.
Harlem Piers Park. That's been something I've tried to incorporate. Had some neighbors that just would start a random text thread, just kind of at the start of the pandemic. Hey, does anyone need anything? Um, and volunteering around efforts to assist community members. Working with a friend of mine who formed a nonprofit organization um, in the food uh, in the food distribution space, Breaking
Right.
Bread NYC, to help aging jazz musicians who were in need of some produce. And so just being mindful of kind of wherever we operate from, there's a greater need. And
Mm,
but at the same time, you are a pressing need for yourself. And it's a balance that I don't juggle well. I aim to,
mhm,
I strive to, um, but I definitely think leaning on our networks, being vocal, um, therapy as a resource is something I fully encourage for those who are able. Um, and, you know, speaking with elders, I've kept a regular conversation with my grandmother during this pandemic. Um, and in no exaggeration, it literally saved her life during one particular instance. And so
uh,
um, I'm mindful that there's a need for us to kind of voice our way through this. And it's not, and sometimes we do that so that others can know it's possible. I think there's power in kind of sharing a journey in the hopes that it eases someone else's journey, and try and incorporate some fruits and vegetables. Still working on that one.
Yeah.
But yeah, those are
Yeah.
some of the tactics and approaches that I've incorporated.
Mix of physical, mental health, yeah, social, community supports. It sounds like a good variety of, yeah, of tactics. And every time we talk, I always come away with a list of good things to read. Any good books you're reading lately, or articles?
I think, let's see.
Or movies?
I had just read Zora Neale Hurston's Barracoon, testament to someone who recalls the Middle Passage, and it was like a lost transcription of a conversation that happened in the early 20th century. So that was kind of a grounding framework for just the legacy of hard times.
Yeah.
I've been reading, I've got on my radar a book. The title is escaping me, but it's actually about the Caribbean communities in Harlem, and the African-American communities at the time in the 30s, and how they navigated the Depression, coming from two sets of cultural distinctive groups, but kind of making a way collectively.
Right.
It was written by a sociologist in the 90s. I'm continuing to stay abreast of conversations on equity, reading about blockchain and kind of the purported digital future, and always centering back on what does that mean for community priorities, and being mindful of who shapes the future and how limited that often is. And then ProPublica released some expose this morning on some of the world's wealthiest and discrepancies in the tax code. And so always thinking about kind of, again, governance, thinking about equitable distribution of resources, thinking about just the misappropriation of the narrative of who actually is relying on government subsidies, and who really, quite honestly, the inversion of what we're publicly told. Because I can tell you, Tesla wouldn't exist if it weren't for government subsidies. So, I think that just being critical of where your news sources are coming from, continuing to encourage folks to really pay attention to local news sources. It's one of my concerns that we're in an age where literally everything is paywalled for the content that we should be getting free access to. And the stuff that is free is highly questionable. And so, the next presidential election, what does that mean? So, we need to be mindful of the thing we're designing and what that means for our future and our process and our insights, integrity, and the truth.
Yeah, definitely harder to nail down the truth sometimes. I have one more kind of quick question, but I wanted to, know if there's any organizations or people, you wanted to highlight or draw attention to, groups you're working with, or any kind of shout out.
Yeah, I'm just grateful. I think at the end of the year we've collectively had and are going through, I'm grateful to science. I am grateful to folks who understand that the way through this is together, and that there's an opportunity and a role that we should all play in making that together possible. I'm encouraging folks to remain hopeful, because there is a future that will need to be designed. And the hope is that we see our agency as sculptors of that, and part of a collective building that is taking place, and that during times of great shift, there's also opportunity. Um, so I think, I could get into specifics of organizations, but I think collectively the idea is just continue. There was a quote I read recently that I shared in a note to my goddaughter for her high school graduation, and it was a quote from Maya Angelou. It said, effectively, my hope for you is that you continue and continue being how and who you are. And that's my hope.
Nice. That's really powerful. The only other thing I just wanted to know is, like, if there's one small scale action that you would suggest that people take today, what would that be?
Come up with a really good analogy for how ranked choice voting works and tell someone. I saw someone laid out with a multitude of purses on, their I think it was their bed or their couch, and they were explaining how they would prioritize their bag selection and why that would matter. Whatever the analogy is, just get folks to know that one and done is not it, and that fifth choice may have as direct an implication, if not more, than the first choice. So really, really take that to heart. I think that for me, I've had conversations with my mother, my mom's a former teacher, retired teacher, who stays active in her union. And so I know that that's something that we've discussed because it's the first rollout. And, for the folks that have remained in New York and are really concerned and thinking about the future of this great city, this is a new mechanism, something that we haven't really seen. And sharing how this works and illuminating kind of an easier analogy for the folks coming down, down to the voting booth is going to be important.
For sure. Yeah, and there could be fun, creative ways of doing that. Anything else, Ken, before we close up? This is great.
I appreciate you taking the lead and informing folks on ways to be civic minded. I think it's important, and I hope that this work continues to be amplified. I hope that we continue to think about how we look out for one another, share best resources, and provide blueprints for ways to make the future that we hope and strive towards attainable, achievable, and inclusive.
And you're right in the middle of it. So I really appreciate what you're doing and you. And I'll just stop the interview, but thank you so much, Ken. It was great.
I'll say just, people make a difference. Culture makes a difference. And there's a lot of work to be done. So let's get to doing it.
Let's do it.